The ferry groaned against the choppy grey waves, a lonely speck against the vast, indifferent ocean. Elias gripped the railing, the salt spray stinging his face, the taste of it bitter on his tongue. He watched as the mainland receded, shrinking into a hazy blur on the horizon, swallowed by the encroaching mist. Ahead, a dark silhouette rose from the turbulent waters. The island. It was a stark, unforgiving place, a jagged outcrop of rock crowned by the imposing figure of the lighthouse. The structure stood tall and proud, a stoic sentinel against the relentless sea, its white paint chipped and weathered by countless storms. As the ferry drew closer, Elias could make out the details: the circular tower, the lantern room at its peak, and the small attached cottage where he would now reside. A sense of isolation settled over him, a heavy cloak of solitude that mirrored the desolate landscape. The air itself felt heavy, with the scent of brine and decay, a premonition of the loneliness to come. The island, shrouded in mist and the cries of gulls, felt less like a new home and more like a world apart. The solitude Elias had sensed on the ferry quickly became a tangible reality. The island was a world of its own, ruled by the rhythm of the tides and the ceaseless cry of seabirds. His days settled into a predictable routine, checking the lamp, maintaining the machinery, logging weather conditions. The lighthouse itself was a marvel of engineering, its intricate clockwork mechanism a testament to human ingenuity against the forces of nature. Elias found a strange comfort in the mechanical precision of it all, the rhythmic ticking and whirring, a constant counterpoint to the crashing waves outside. But as the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, casting long shadows across the island, a different kind of rhythm began to emerge. It started subtly, a faint whisper carried on the wind, a creak in the floorboards when no one was there. At first, Elias dismissed them as tricks of the wind or the settling of the old structure. He'd tell himself it was the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Yet the whispers persisted, growing bolder each night. Sometimes he would swear he heard his name called, a hushed murmur just beyond the threshold of hearing. Doors that he was certain he had closed would swing open, revealing nothing but empty corridors. A chill would permeate the air, a coldness that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. The feeling of being watched became a constant companion, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck that refused to dissipate. The rational explanations began to wear thin, replaced by a growing unease that settled deep in his bones. The unease that had been building within Elias reached a crescendo on a night of particularly dense fog. The foghorn blared its mournful cry into the thick white blanket that enveloped the island, each blast echoing back from the unseen cliffs. Elias stood watch in the lantern room, his eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable veil. The usual whispers were amplified, swirling around him like disembodied voices. Then he saw it. A figure materialized from the fog, just beyond the glass panes of the lantern room. It was the spectral form of a man, his clothes clinging to his emaciated frame, water dripping from his ghostly hair. His face was etched with a profound sadness, his eyes wide with a lingering terror. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on Elias, before letting out a heart-wrenching wail, a sound filled with such raw grief and despair that it seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the lighthouse. The sound was not just heard, but felt, a deep resonance in Elias's chest. The apparition then slowly faded back into the fog, leaving Elias breathless and shaken, the chilling lament echoing in his ears long after the foghorn's next blast. The rationalizations he had clung to vanished, replaced by a stark, undeniable truth: he was not alone. The vision of the spectral mariner haunted Elias. Sleep offered little respite, his dreams filled with the man's sorrowful eyes and the chilling echo of his lament. Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, Elias began to delve into the history of the lighthouse and the surrounding waters. He spent hours in the small library within the cottage, poring over old charts, logbooks, and local histories. He discovered a grim litany of shipwrecks, each one a tragic tale of lives lost to the unforgiving sea. Vessels of all kinds, fishing boats, merchant ships, even grand passenger liners, had met their end on the treacherous reefs that surrounded the island. He found records of storms that had raged for days, blinding fog that had disoriented even the most experienced navigators, and sudden, unpredictable currents that had dragged ships onto the rocks. The sheer number of tragedies was staggering, a testament to the power of the ocean and the fragility of human endeavors. Among the dusty volumes, he stumbled upon a tattered, leather-bound journal. It belonged to a previous lighthouse keeper, a man named Silas Blackwood, who had served at the Farol da Névoa in the late 19th century. As Elias turned the brittle pages, he found entries detailing strange occurrences, unexplained noises, fleeting shadows, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Blackwood's entries grew increasingly frantic, hinting at something more sinister than mere coincidence. The journal ended abruptly, leaving Elias with a chilling sense of foreboding. The past, it seemed, was not quite finished with the Farol da Névoa. The journal entries of Silas Blackwood had opened a door to a terrifying reality. The strange occurrences Elias had experienced were not isolated incidents, but echoes of a long and tragic history. The visions, once singular and terrifying, began to multiply. It was as if the fog itself was a canvas upon which the past was replaying itself. During the long nights, Elias witnessed scenes of unimaginable horror. He saw ships crashing against the jagged rocks, their hulls splintering under the force of the waves. He saw men struggling in the icy water, their cries for help swallowed by the roar of the storm. He saw faces contorted in fear and desperation, their eyes pleading for salvation. These weren't just fleeting glimpses anymore. They were vivid, almost tangible experiences. He felt the icy spray on his skin, heard the screams of the drowning men, and smelled the acrid scent of salt water and decaying wood. The lantern room became a gallery of the lost, a stage upon which the tragedies of the past unfolded before his very eyes. He began to recognize individual faces among the spectral figures, each one a silent testament to the sea's cruel power. The weight of their collective suffering pressed down on him, a heavy burden of grief and despair. Amidst the terrifying visions, Elias began to notice a peculiar pattern. It wasn't related to the apparitions themselves, but to the lighthouse's instruments. Every night, precisely at the stroke of midnight, the compass in the lantern room would begin to behave erratically. The needle, usually steady and true, would spin wildly, as if caught in a magnetic storm. The effect lasted for only a few minutes, but it was consistent, occurring without fail, regardless of the weather conditions. At first, Elias suspected a malfunction, checking the compass meticulously for any signs of damage or wear. But the instrument was in perfect working order. He consulted the lighthouse's maintenance logs, but there was no record of similar anomalies in the past. The phenomenon was baffling, a scientific impossibility. He tried to correlate the compass's erratic behavior with the appearance of the ghostly figures, but there was no direct connection. The visions came and went throughout the night, seemingly independent of the compass's strange dance. Yet, the timing was too precise to be mere coincidence. The midnight hour, a time often associated with the supernatural, seemed to hold a particular significance at the Farol da Névoa. Elias began to suspect that the compass wasn't malfunctioning at all, but reacting to some unseen force, a force that manifested itself at the same time every night. A force that was somehow connected to the tragedies that had befallen the ships around the island. A chilling thought began to form in his mind. What if the shipwrecks weren't simply accidents of nature? What if something else was at play? The unsettling anomaly with the compass fueled Elias's growing suspicion that something more sinister lay behind the numerous shipwrecks. He began to explore the lighthouse more thoroughly, searching for any clues that might explain the strange occurrences. One afternoon, while inspecting the base of the tower, he noticed a loose stone in the wall. Upon closer examination, he discovered it was part of a cleverly concealed doorway. With some effort, he managed to pry the stone loose, revealing a narrow, dark passage leading downwards. Armed with a lantern, Elias cautiously descended into the depths of the lighthouse. The air in the passage was damp and cold, thick with the smell of mildew and damp earth. The passage opened into a small, subterranean chamber. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs hung like macabre decorations. In the center of the chamber, Elias found a large, intricate mechanism made of brass and iron. It was clearly very old, and parts of it were damaged and rusted. He recognized some of the components as being related to the lighthouse's original lighting system, a system that had been replaced decades ago by the modern electric lamp. But this mechanism was different, more complex. As he examined it more closely, he noticed that some of the wires had been deliberately cut, and certain gears were jammed. It was clear this mechanism hadn't simply fallen into disrepair, it had been sabotaged. A cold dread washed over Elias. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The compass anomaly, the ghostly visions, the numerous shipwrecks. They were all connected. Someone had intentionally disabled the lighthouse, leading countless ships to their doom. The discovery of the sabotaged mechanism confirmed Elias's worst fears. The shipwrecks weren't accidents, they were the result of a deliberate act of malice. He returned to the cottage, his mind racing, and retrieved the journal of Silas Blackwood. He reread the increasingly frantic entries, searching for any mention of the hidden chamber or the sabotaged mechanism. Then, towards the very end of the journal, he found it, a single chilling entry written in a shaky hand. The whispers have become screams. I can no longer bear the weight of this secret. They came to me in the night offering gold, promising wealth beyond my wildest dreams. All I had to do was turn off the light, just for a few hours, on certain nights. They said it was a small thing, that no harm would come of it. But they were wrong, so terribly wrong. The ships, I hear their cries in the wind. I see their faces in the waves. The guilt is a constant torment, a fire that burns within my soul. I can no longer live with this burden. God forgive me. The entry ended there abruptly, as if Blackwood had been interrupted. Elias closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. The confession was clear. Blackwood, driven by greed, had been complicit in the shipwrecks, disabling the lighthouse for a price. The ghostly visions Elias had witnessed were not just echoes of tragedy. They were the tormented souls of the victims, seeking justice, seeking peace. And now, Elias understood the significance of the compass anomaly. It wasn't a supernatural phenomenon, but a direct consequence of the sabotaged mechanism, disrupting the magnetic field around the lighthouse at the precise times when the light had been extinguished. A storm was brewing. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping the sea into a frenzy. Dark, ominous clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the last vestiges of daylight. The waves crashed against the rocks with renewed ferocity, sending plumes of spray high into the air. Elias watched from the lantern room, a sense of dread settling over him. The storm felt different, more intense than any he had witnessed before. It was as if the very elements were mirroring the turmoil within him. As midnight approached, the wind reached a fever pitch, and the rain began to fall in torrents. The lighthouse shuddered under the force of the storm, its beams of light cutting through the darkness like desperate pleas. Then, as the clock struck 12, the compass began its erratic dance. The needle spun wildly, a chaotic blur against the instrument's face. But this time, the effect was amplified, more violent than ever before. The entire lantern room seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. The visions returned, more vivid and terrifying than any Elias had experienced. The ghostly figures were no longer silent specters. They were screaming, their cries echoing through the storm, mingling with the roar of the wind and the crash of the waves. They were reliving their final moments, their terror palpable, their despair contagious. Elias felt overwhelmed by their collective suffering, a crushing weight of grief and fear. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this night was different. This night, the past was not just replaying itself, it was demanding to be heard. As the storm raged outside, a new presence manifested within the lantern room. It wasn't one of the drowning sailors, but a figure different from the others, radiating a distinct aura of guilt and torment. It was the spectral form of Silas Blackwood, the former lighthouse keeper. His ghostly figure flickered in the dim light, his face contorted in a mask of anguish. Unlike the other apparitions, he seemed aware of Elias's presence, his spectral eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and desperation. He began to speak, his voice a low, mournful whisper that barely cut through the din of the storm. "It was me," he confessed, his voice laced with regret. "I turned off the light. I let them die." His spectral form trembled, as if reliving the horror of his actions. "They promised me riches, but all I found was damnation." He reached out a translucent hand towards Elias, as if pleading for forgiveness. "You must stop them," he whispered, his voice growing weaker. "They won't rest until the truth is known." Suddenly, the other ghostly figures, sensing Blackwood's presence, turned their attention towards him. Their cries intensified, their spectral forms swirling around him like accusing spirits. They seemed to recognize him, to understand his role in their demise. Blackwood recoiled in terror, his spectral form flickering violently. He tried to retreat, but the other ghosts surrounded him, their anguished cries echoing through the lantern room. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of judgment and retribution. Witnessing Blackwood's torment, Elias felt a surge of pity. Despite the man's terrible actions, he was now a prisoner of his own guilt, trapped in an endless cycle of remorse. Elias knew he had to do something to break the cycle. He remembered the sabotaged mechanism in the chamber below. If he could repair it, restore the lighthouse to its proper function, perhaps it would bring some measure of peace to the tormented souls. Ignoring the swirling ghosts and the raging storm, Elias rushed down the winding stairs to the base of the tower. He found the hidden passage and descended into the damp chamber. Working quickly, he reconnected the severed wires and adjusted the jammed gears. With a final click, the mechanism sprang back to life. A low hum filled the chamber, and a faint light began to emanate from the old lamp. As the mechanism whirred back into operation, a change swept through the lighthouse. The violent shaking subsided, the compass needle steadied, and the cacophony of ghostly cries began to fade. Upstairs, Elias saw the spectral figures slowly dissipate, their anguished expressions replaced by a look of serene acceptance. Even Blackwood's tormented figure seemed to find a measure of peace, his spectral form fading into the light. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside. The wind died down, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the dark clouds began to part, revealing a sliver of pale sunlight. Elias stood in the lantern room, watching as the first rays of the morning sun kissed the calm sea. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the rocks. The ghostly visions were gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The lighthouse, its light now burning steadily, stood as a beacon of hope against the vast expanse of the ocean. Elias looked out at the horizon, the memory of the previous night still fresh in his mind. He had faced the darkness, confronted the ghosts of the past, and helped to bring them some measure of solace. The Farol da Névoa was no longer a place of torment, but a sanctuary, a guardian of the sea. He had found his place here, not just as a keeper of the light, but as a guardian of the lost souls who had found their final resting place in the waters surrounding the island. The weight that had burdened him since his arrival had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and a quiet understanding. The island, once a symbol of isolation and fear, now felt like home.